Campaigners, quick historical lesson. The first democracy that we know about in the Western world occurred in Greece, and it occurred around 500 BC. This is an organization of society in which, for the very first time, to our knowledge, that property-owning males specifically were allowed to speak in public and then vote on their collective governance. If there was going to be a new public building, if there was going to be an increase in taxes, if there was going to be a war against Sparta, this was a matter for public argument, public dispute, and public debate. And so since matters of personal concern as well as the concern of the polis of the entire country were now subject to debate, subject to argument, subject to public speech, it became really important for people who wanted to get their way to become really excellent public speakers. In other words, a market for public speech developed. When there was a market, there were people who were going to sell goods. So the first communication consultants that we know of, the sophists, would travel around the country teaching those who could hire them, the wealthiest, how to speak more eloquently, more effectively, more dramatically in public in order to get what they wanted from their fellow citizens, in order to curry favor, in order to curry votes. And over time, what happened is that the sophists started to realize that certain patterns of argument, certain turns of phrase, certain constructions of sentences were more effective and more memorable than others. And so what they did was they started to teach their students how to use rhetorical devices. So now when you see a kind of amazing stylized speech. Let's take Lincoln's first or second inaugural address, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, some other inaugural addresses. What we'll find is certain repetitions, certain patterns of argument, certain rhyme schemes. Think of this almost like poetry, except for nonfiction. We're talking about here strategic repetition, alliteration, repetition at the begins and ends of sentences, specific kinds of imagery, things of that nature. You'll find that these kinds of speeches are overwhelmingly reliant on rhetorical devices because, and we've learned this since 500 BC, that's in a sense what audiences will remember. So when you look at a campaign speech, when you hear a campaign speech, when you hear like Biden's inaugural or Trump's inaugural, or you hear these kinds of famous speeches, what is often the case is that the speechwriter, and maybe the candidate him or herself, but very likely just the speechwriter, has looked back to history and has looked back to see for positive models and negative models, and then those are self-reinforcing. So the kinds of turns of phrases, the kinds of rhetorical devices that Lincoln used in a particular standpoint in history when the country was really polarized and divided might be useful for another candidate, perhaps Joe Biden, who just gave his inaugural, to give on that same kind of occasion. So the point is that what we've learned from the sophists from 500 BC to the present is that these kinds of rhetorical devices, specific patterns of phrase, turns of argument, have cross-cultural appeal, and that's what I'm going to take you on now, a kind of brief whirlwind tour of the use of rhetorical devices, a variety of rhetorical devices in campaign stump speeches from the modern era.